Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest Honey and Stag literary event, Author Showcase. I'm very excited, thrilled to be interviewing today's author because at present she's writing in a period that fascinates me, and I've got lots of questions to ask her about that. And viewers, just to say, as we're watching and going along, if you have any questions for our author, please feel free to write them in the comment box, and she'll respond. Anyway, without further ado, allow me to welcome into the studio Lexie Conyngham.
Hi, thank you very much, Jacky.
Hi, welcome. It's an absolute pleasure and a thrill to have you here. And I hope you don't mind if over the next hour I probe you considerably about about your work and in particular the latest series that you're writing. Your most recent book, Dragon in the Snow, that's the third book in the Conyngham Murders series, and published by the Kellercat Press. And that was published in August this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, very recently.
Yeah. So yeah, beautiful. I think any author who is A, managing to write, and B, managing to publish during these times that we're living in deserves an extra medal. Seriously. For anybody watching who isn't familiar with Lexie and her work, Lexie is a historian, and she's based up in the Highlands. She has two previous series, Murray of Letho and Hippolyta Napier series, and they are based, as her bio says, I love this, amid Scotland's old cities, ancient universities, and hidden away aristocratic estates. And I'm going to ask a little bit about those before we get into the current series. But first of all, if you wouldn't mind telling us about, you are obviously a historian, and I presume that the historian came before being the published author. Am I correct in that?
Yes, I suppose so. I'm an archivist by trade.
Mm-hmm.
So I spend my days amongst historical documents of various kinds. And it's if you wanted to be a writer since you knew what books were, then you're always picking up little interesting fragments from the documents you're working with. So I always had huge notebooks stuffed with information and references all the time I was working in archives. And I'm freelance now, but I still collect little bits and pieces wherever I go.
As you go. So working as an archivist, if you could give us a flavour of where were you based to do that, and where was the most intriguing spot that you were able to travel to or access in doing your archival work?
Well, for a long time, I was in Edinburgh Castle, working in an archive there. And then I moved to the Scottish National Archives. I can't remember what they're called this week, but in those days, it was the Scottish Record Office. And I worked in the public search room, which meant you dealt with pretty much everything, really. But one of the most fascinating series of records was called the Precognitions, which was witness statements given by anybody that the powers that be thought had evidence for a trial. And they're not in legalese, they're written very much as the person spoke them. And a lot of them are quite dull, because it's really, well, he took her out and hit her on the head and she dropped dead. And it's pretty obvious then who done it. But some of them are really intriguing, and the witnesses disagree, and there are mysterious references to people in cloaks, or odd figures appearing at the ends of darkened streets and things like that. And you just think, oh, I want to go into this further. I want to know what happened. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you know, and sometimes the case was abandoned for whatever reason. So they bring that period to life just instantly. You're there, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I wonder then, at what point you're working there as the archivist, the series that are now attached to your name, popular historical series, were they already bubbling within you before you began your work in the archives, or did they emerge from that work that you were doing?
I wanted to write crime fiction. I've wanted to write crime fiction since I was about 10. And I wanted to write contemporary crime fiction. And then I realized that I'm just too slow with the technology. So my detective, whoever he or she was going to be, would have to be a complete idiot with mobile phones and computers and things. And that's just not going to work in the police, for example. When I started working in the Scottish Record Office, of course, it's in the new town in Edinburgh, and you're surrounded by everything Georgian, just beautiful buildings.
So beautiful.
Yeah. And I thought, well, why not? I love the history. Why not make use of it and go back and set my first series there? So that started in 1806 for, I think, no particular reason. And then it because of various things, I decided to go back and write 2 books that happened before that. And so they're now the first 2 books. And he actually starts in St Andrews rather than in Edinburgh. But there's always a close Edinburgh connection.
And in the Hippolyta series, do you stay in Edinburgh, or do you take her elsewhere?
She's from Edinburgh, but she's a bit later. That series starts in 1829, and it's set on Deeside before it became Royal Deeside. I love Ballater and Braemar and travelling up there. And there was a very dramatic incident in 1829 called the Muckle Spate, which was a huge flood, affected all the rivers in Deeside and the Highlands, did a huge amount of damage. And just about the time I was thinking, I want to start a new series because Murray, the hero of the first series, is getting old far too quickly, and I want to slow down. So I thought, I'm quite interested in Deeside, but I don't quite know when to set it or when to start it. And just around then, Ballater was hit by another terrible flood at New Year in, was it 2016? Oh gosh, I'm very bad at dates for a historian. And so I thought, well, actually, that's very interesting because I can think about the flood now, look at the effect it had now, but I can concentrate on the flood that happened in 1829. I think I'll maybe start there. And actually, it's a fascinating period because we're looking at a lot of political reform. We're looking at the final abolition of slavery. And although Ballater is a small town, even then it was a big tourist trap. And so people bring their problems to Ballater and fight them out there. So it was a lucky chance, but I've enjoyed researching it.
Wonderful. Thank you. I love how, even as we sit here in our conversation, and your responses are just full of historical facts. So, but to come to your process of creating your stories and creating your characters, to what extent are you conscious of not overpopulating the text with too much fact, so that people maybe, are you very aware that for you, those facts dance and shimmer and are full of magic, but for others it may be, so as you go, how do you measure yourself? Do you?
Ooh. Yes, I'm very aware of the danger of lecturing. You don't want to sit there. It's not a textbook after all. So I suppose I try to let the characters take the story forward, and it's how what's going on affects them, because that's what brings history to life anyway, is thinking about what the ordinary person in the street had to deal with at any one time. So yes, trying to think that not either that I think in some instances, I've seen writers where they have one character who knows everything and explains it to all the other characters. And another way of doing it is to have every character seems to know everything that's going on. And I think I like to strike a balance where not, because it's the same today. You maybe didn't catch the last news bulletin, or you're not that interested in what's happening in the American elections or whatever. And not everyone knows everything. And so I try to make it just as natural as possible, that they're humans and they're just dealing with things in a human way.
Yeah. And I think you know, those everyday stories, whenever those days occur, that
Mm.
do draw the reader in. But I do think there's an extra element to historical fiction, you know, because it's not only me being in the story, but me being back then in the
Mm.
story, and you know, how would I have reacted, and what would this have felt like? You know, I can read contemporary crime fiction, and it's easier in a way, or maybe not as, you know, it doesn't transport you as far, I don't think, as historical,
Mm.
you know, crime
Yeah.
fiction does.
It's like writing in another country, really. Well,
Mm,
you
mm.
say past is another country, but yes, it's sometimes when I feel I haven't been to a place enough for research, I have to remember that I can't actually go to the place anyway because it's 200 years ago or whenever.
Yeah, or even yeah, which is a perfect moment for me to ask you. So having been writing in the 1800s, and being really familiar, you know, with that period, that time, everything, you then, for the Orkneyinga texts, you go way back. When was the moment? Yeah, when was the sort of light bulb moment that says, I'm headed that way?
It was pride and stupidity. I was I was helping my mother move house in a house she'd lived in for many years, and an old neighbour came to say goodbye. And he's a few years older than me, so when we were children, of course, we never spoke because he's a few years older than me. Um, but we got chatting, and my mother, of course, biggest fan, said she writes books, you know. And he said, "Oh, what do you write?" And I said, "Well, crime fiction." And he said, "Oh, I love crime fiction. What kind?" And I said, historical." "Oh," he said, "do you write anything Viking? Because I love Vikings." And I said, no, I write Georgian mostly." And I thought to myself, how could you possibly write Viking crime fiction? Don't be ridiculous. And of course, that put the seed in my mind. And I thought, Viking, you know, maybe could do a bit of, I wonder. And it wasn't long after that, I happened to be going down to York, and I went to the Jorvik Centre there.
Mm,
It was excellent.
it's beautiful.
Very,
Yeah.
very good fun. And I thought, you know, I think maybe I could think of a plot, maybe just the one,
Mhm.
just to
Yeah.
start me off, and you know, I'll see what happens. And the next thing I knew, I was off. But the trouble was that I hadn't really realised, being an archivist and absorbing all those little details over the years, little bits and pieces about the Georgian period and Edinburgh and that area of history. I hadn't realised just how much research I would have to do all in a bundle to get myself up to the same sort of standard. So I had to decide where to set it to start with, and I thought, well, York's nice. Be a good excuse to pop down to York. Or Norway. I have friends in Norway. I could go to Norway, and I'm learning Norwegian, so that would be, you know, a good excuse for that. And then I thought, well, actually, you know, Orkney's pretty good to go to. Really, very nice to go to.
Mm.
And I hadn't been up for a while. I used to go up there for work every now and again. And I thought, well, that's quite a nice excuse. I could do that. And it suddenly all started to make sense because it's not that far from us really, and it's a lovely place to go to. And I do speak the language, fortunately. And it just had such a range of possibilities around the time that I was interested in, which was when the old religions are starting to give way to Christianity and the conflicts involved in that. And Earl Thorfinn, who was in charge in Orkney at that time, had a huge domain stretching from Shetland down to Whitby and over to the Western Isles. And there was just such potential there that I thought, no, got to go with that. That's
Could
just.
go with that.
Hmm.
Do you know what I'm struck with? I'm struck with how 3 books have come out of almost a challenge that was based way back in childhood. You know, like this boy that I never spoke to because he was older than I was, and it
Yeah,
wasn't. And he drops the seed,
yeah.
and it sets you off on this journey. And
Mhm.
I just think again, there's almost an element of magical wonder in thinking that if you pull at a thread, who knows where it will take you? And the process that you say of York or Norway, but even that geographical location and how it's to me, what I'm seeing as you talk about it, I'm seeing curtains open.
Yeah.
You know, as if in a play, and that location of Orkney just pulls both ways, you know, over to Norway, over to Iceland, and down. And it's just, sorry, you have me in a total reverie. It's wonderful, and it's and it's the perfect moment, if you wouldn't mind doing your first reading. And we agreed before coming on air that Lexie would do a reading from each book in the series. So this first reading is from book 1, Tomb for an Eagle. So settle back and let's enjoy the first text. Thank you, Lexie.
Thank you. A little bit of context here. Catel is the hero. He's just arrived in Orkney to meet Earl Thorfinn, but Earl Thorfinn's away, and he ends up in Einar's hall. And just as he's about to identify himself and ask for help, a woman comes in to announce that she's found a slightly long dead body on some land she owns between a cliff and the sea. And the community at the time being what it is, everyone in the hall decides to go off and investigate. What shall we do with him then? Einar asked, lifting loose soil from a pair of stained leather boots, long laces treble wrapped over the stiff ankles. Couldn't we just leave him here? Sigrid's suggestion seemed to surprise everyone. Einar blinked at her. Wouldn't you mind? He's on land you graze. Well, it's not going to be pleasant to move him. He might as well lie here as anywhere. Well, what if he was a Christian? Asked Einar mildly. We could take him to the new churchyard. He's not lying like a Christian, Hlifolf remarked. Has he a cross? Asked Einar. Then, as no one else moved, he leaned over the corpse, lips firmly closed against the smell, and delicately touched the man's chin and neck. His fingers flew back suddenly, stained black. Of course, he said, almost to himself, of course. He looked up at them all, stuck there in the gully's neck like dunters in a rock pool. His throat is cut. Well, obviously, Catel thought, the man had not buried himself up here, far from public view. What had they all thought? What had Einar thought? Then he was murdered? Hlifolf was the first to put it into words. But who would have done that? Or maybe somebody killed him in a boat and hid him here, suggested Bjarni. It was the first time any of the crowd had spoken since they had arrived, and everyone jumped. He's not a small man, Sigrid objected. It's a hard climb, even without carrying something. I know, I tried to rescue a sheep that way once. There was general agreement, as if Bjarni's interjection had given them all permission to have opinions. Bjarni, too, had gained confidence. Can we turn him on his back so we can all see his face? And his right arm, too. Is he holding a weapon? Is there anything else that might tell us who he is? Thank heavens for someone with a bit of wit, Catel thought, watching as Sigrid and Einar between them eased the man's shoulders back, turning his head. The gash in his neck was black and filthy, and there was some damage to the cheek that had lain on the earth. Whatever had eaten his eyes and lips, no doubt, a softer meal than that knee. His right hand was lying in a mound of some kind, tucked partly under the tail of his cloak. Sigrid disentangled the fabric carefully. She pulled it clear, laying the border of the cloak over the man's legs. A length of stained braid edged it, the colours only a little faded in the dirt. Left bare, the odd mound seemed to shiver in the air. She gave a little cry. What's that? Gasped Einar with a start. Hlifolf peered over Sigrid's shoulder as the crowd, breathing heavily, leaned forward. Catel could see feathers, gaunt but strong, yellow bone, and the edge of a fierce beak. It appears to be an eagle, Hlifolf said. An eagle? What's it doing there? Snapped Einar. But that, for once, seemed to be a question that not even Hlifolf could answer.
Lexie, thank you so much for taking us back in time and taking us to these characters that you've developed so beautifully. If we can go to those and talk about Catel and Sigrid, and how did they form for you, and the choice of names, because going back to a time when names were slightly different, and knowing how, you know, there's a range to choose from. So I just want you to unpick your process of bringing these two characters to life.
Well, Sigrid, one of the things I did to develop the research for the books, I knit endlessly. My knitting is sitting over there just now. One of the bits of my knitting, there were other bits dotted around the house. They didn't knit in Viking times. They did naalbinding, which is a kind of very sturdy crochet almost. And they did tablet weaving, which produced those nice braids that we've just seen on the edge of the cloak of the murder victim. And weaving, of course, weaving sails, weaving cloaks, weaving all kinds of things. So I did a bit of that. I did a bit of card weaving, tablet weaving. I was very bad at naalbinding. I've only learnt that in the last few weeks. Somebody has actually sat me down and taught me properly how to naalbind. And so I felt that I realized through my reading that Viking women were actually pretty strong, pretty important in society. I think a lot of our conception of history is sort of blinded by Victorian times, and we think that every woman in history was put down as much as Victorian women seemed to be. But anyway, Viking women were quite able to divorce a man pretty spontaneously. There's a Viking saying that you don't force a woman into marriage because it's just going to end up in trouble and there'll be nastiness of all kinds. And Viking women had to run things while their men were away raiding. So they knew about farming, they knew about marketing, dealing, and dealing with all kinds of things that cropped up while the men were away. So they were pretty strong. And so I was quite keen to have a woman, and I decided to have a woman who is a widow and a wool worker. So she's got a bit of independence, although she is pretty poor, but she makes her living braiding, naalbinding, weaving for other women and helping other women to learn how to do it as well if they're not in a position to have been taught by their mothers. So she leapt out quite smartly. But I'm not sure where Catel came from, to be honest. He just appeared. And I think it's useful to have him because, of course, there were situations that a woman would not be encouraged to participate in. She can't, for instance, go into the monastic buildings that Thorfinn is building. But Catel can go in and do things like that. And he's a very committed Christian in this new strange religion. And Sigrid is going along with it because Thorfinn says it's the right thing to do. And they will come up with, they'll meet people who are very much attached to the old religion, and there'll be conflicts there. So to give them that background, I thought was important. I also, just as a tribute to the fact that I quite wanted to set the book in Norway in the first place, they are both of Norwegian extraction, even though they grew up together in Denmark. But it's typical of the Viking world. People moved around a lot, and we don't really think about that again. We think people grew up in a village and stayed there all their lives. Vikings did not. The Vikings got in those ships and they got going. And Catel loves sailing, which is an awful shame because I get seasick. So my research on that is going to be a bit more secondhand, really. Either that or I'm going to be dosed up on Stugeron.
I think I think you probably have to take that for the team, because there's nothing like first-hand experience.
No.
Yeah, if we can stick with Catel and Sigrid, the idea, how is it that they come to work together? I mean, in a contemporary novel, you would see these two set in they'd be beautiful in a police procedural, I think. They'd so work in some Scandi noir, set in Oslo, something like that. But I'm thinking back to that time period, would it, because I know this is fiction, and fiction allows for so much, but would two characters like these, would there be the opportunity for them to actually form this partnership to do this kind of investigation?
I think it derives in their case from their childhood friendship. They grew up together in Hedmark. and hadn't seen each other since then. They parted company when they were about 10, and then by chance met again in Orkney. And although Sigrid is that little bit younger, she just regards Ketil as her stupid little brother who needs her help. And so, because she's quite a strong character, I think I don't think society would have minded particularly. But because she's a widow, which always gives you much more respectability than just a single woman anyway, she's able just to boss him around and tell him what to do, and get cross with him when he does something stupid. And she never thinks he's any good at anything, because he's actually quite a good warrior. He's been very successful for Thorfinn. Otherwise, Thorfinn wouldn't appoint him to the positions of responsibility that he has. But she doesn't think that much of Thorfinn sometimes either. She thinks he's a bit thick too. So she doesn't suffer fools terribly gladly. So yes, whether or not society, I think society would have been quite happy with their rather fraternal relationship, as it looks anyway.
And just the last thing, I will come back to these characters, but I really enjoyed what you say, and I think it's hard for us to get into the mindset if we're not familiar with Viking life, that women had this, this sense of agency. It was okay to do certain things and be certain things, and I think there's much to be learned from that. But anyway, ensuring that you create an authentic setting as possible. Have you spent time up in Orkney, and what kind of records have you accessed to do this?
That's the frustrated archivist. There are no documents. There are the sagas, but the sagas weren't written down until medieval times, so they're a lot later. You can derive some things from them, like names. You asked earlier about names, and most of them are saga-based names. I've, of course, walked on the Broch and all about there, but the Broch would probably have looked different then. So I've read a lot of archaeological reports, and some in particular postulate they try to identify what bits of land have been worn away by the sea since Viking times. So I've reconstructed those in the books, which makes it a lot easier to get from the mainland to the Broch. You don't have to wait for low tide. And visited museums, gone to digs, read a huge amount of research. I've also just recently been to a Viking festival, which was hilarious, and had some very good warriors. I think they were from Combat International, who were doing very authentic Viking fighting. I learned a huge amount from that, actually, just watching them getting their kit on, strapping on the padded vests and the chainmail, and then getting stuck in the chainmail and having to have somebody come around the back and haul it down. Very, very interesting watching the technique.
Where did you do that?
This was at Duncarron medieval village near Denny in Stirlingshire.
I'm just thinking if we've got viewers, I know probably at the moment, it's difficult to envisage doing, activities like that, but when the time permits again, so Duncarron, yeah?
Yes. There was also a Viking festival in Orkney last year, but it was its first year and it didn't get the chance to run this year. And then, of course, there's the Jorvik festival down in York in February each year. But it clashes with Granite Noir, so I haven't been to it yet.
Yeah, that's tricky, isn't it? The choices, it's like they could move that festival in Jorvik a bit, I think, but no, So, sticking with the research and thinking back to the 3 novels so far, and the crimes that you've included, are they based? You say, like the sagas is really, the only manuscripts, and they're not from the time. But are any of those crimes that you have, are they based on what you've read, or have you just made them up beautifully?
Very few of them are based on what I've read, except the last book, Dragon in the Snow, is to do with arson. And there has been quite a lot of research on Arson in Viking Orkney. For one thing, when Thorfinn, of course, was a real historical character, and he fell out with his nephew, Ronald. They were very good friends, split up Orkney between them, ruled it together, and then they fell out. And each of them at various stages tried to burn the other one out of his hall. That was a thing you did. And Thorfinn broke out of the back of the building somehow, carrying his wife in his arms. And I've sort of taken that and made sure that Thorfinn always has barrels of water around his hall now. He's a bit paranoid about being burnt out again. But it's curious because the Orkney Viking houses were stone built, of course, with turf roofs, whereas the Norwegian ones and the Danish ones would have been wooden, more wooden anyway. So it's quite a challenge to burn them, but they went for it in a big way. And they even had special names for arson. So if somebody was convicted of arson and exiled, he was known as a brennuvager, a burningswolf, which is just brilliant. So I read that. I thought, oh, one of those.
I love that name. Yeah. I wonder if Guy Fawkes had succeeded. I'm just going in another historical period. I'm thinking probably he would have been one of them. But anyway, I'm looking at the clock, and I do believe it's time for our second reading. And so Lexie's going to take us to book 2, A Wolf at the Gate. And Orkney gets a visitor from further afield. So Lexie, please, if you will.
Thank you. Sigrid is staying with a married couple that she knows in order to teach the wife how to do null-binding and tablet weaving. This is a thankless task, but on the other hand, the wife is a very good housekeeper and a good cook, which Sigrid isn't, so she's enjoying staying there. And the wife is called Olvor. Olvor was her usual self the next morning, sweeping the details of the flag floor as breakfast cooked over the fire, wiping cups clean even though she'd washed them before she went to bed. Sigrid stretched and pulled a shawl over her shift to go out to the privy, nodding a mumbled good morning to Olvor. Asmund was not apparent, but the curtains were still drawn around his and Olvor's bed space. It was unusual for him to sleep late. He liked to be out and about when it was quiet. Once out of the privy, Sigrid rubbed her forehead and eyes and gave the day a brief, assessing glance. There was a little har, but it would burn off quickly, she thought. No end yet to this spell of hot weather. The grass about the longhouse, nibbled short, was yellowish. Absently, she pulled a tuft of dun-coloured wool off a bush, then saw another, larger and cleaner, on the next bush. The grass prickled her bare feet as she worked the wool off the tangled twigs. There was something else pale further along the back of the longhouse, up at the far end. Already cleaning out the rubbish from the wool she was holding, feeling the oils soften her fingers, she walked along the field edge towards the corner of the gently curving building. She was only halfway when she heard the scream. She ran the rest of the way, sure it had come from that direction. At the corner of the longhouse, she stopped, grabbing the sharp angles of the sandstone slabs to steady herself. It took a long moment to take in what she saw. Up the hill, not quite in line with Olvor's longhouse, was the home of their neighbours, Ubbi and Steinar. To this, at the lower end, was their own privy, its woven door swinging. Thorgunna stood beside it, shift rumpled, shawl askew, mouth agape. Ubbi was emerging from the longhouse door. He must have heard the scream. Sigrid felt that she was examining the scene in a spiral, from the most distant details sweeping round slowly, reluctantly to the focus. Asmund stood to Sigrid's right, as if he'd come up from his own door, maybe going to look for his friend Steinar. His face was blank. Sigrid's eyes swiveled a little further, a little closer to where she was standing. Halfway between the two houses, Svanhild lay like a great white bird flung across a low wall. Sigrid could hear her gasping breaths. In her arms, Steinar lay, his face grey, his arm flung down on Asmund's side of the dike. And Steinar's head. Sigrid's empty stomach lurched, though her mind would hardly take it in. Steinar's head had taken on a strange, inhuman shape. The cause was clear. There was an axe embedded far into his skull.
If anybody's having snacks while we're enjoying the reading, For us in the Western world, the notion of somebody, being killed with an axe through the head, it's a little bit hard to take. But I think at the time, a very typical manner in which to dispatch someone, was it not?
Yeah, axes were the favorite weapon for Viking warriors. Not by comparatively few of them had swords, and they didn't deal that much in bows and arrows. But an axe was awfully handy, and you could use it day to day as well, chopping wood, of course, even chopping a bit of rope sometimes. It was you could just shove the handle into your belt and off you went. So and much easier. You couldn't draw a sword one-handed before the invention of the I think it's the Browning belt, which came much later, centuries later. So an axe you can just tweak out, off you go.
Yeah, and you look like you've practiced that as well, Lexie.
No comment at all.
No. Now, so the second book it has at its heart the visit of an abbot from Saxony, and again the choice of this part. Why did you go along those lines? Why this outsider coming in?
I think that was typical of Viking life. There were always outsiders coming in. He's there to help Thorfinn work out a currency and tax system, and so that's not going to be popular. People don't warm to currency and tax systems really. So he's off to a bad start. He doesn't speak anything but Saxon and Latin. So poor Tosti, who's the local priest, has to spend an inordinate amount of time translating for him, and he doesn't. The abbot doesn't use one word where a dozen will do. Mm-hmm. So Tosti is absolutely exhausted, and he's quite a sweet little character. So I enjoyed working with him. But what I was looking at was partly the early Christian attitude to disability and disfigurement. That there was a period around this time. It happened under Viking old religions as well, that shall we say, a flawed child at birth would be exposed because they were just going to be a drain on the community. This developed into the thought that they were not worthy to be baptized and brought into the church. So it was a belief that was developing, and not in a very nice way. And a question of what you would do then as a mother of a child who was perhaps perceived to be, in some sense, disfigured, particularly since an awful lot of grown-ups were disfigured anyway, because there were bits chopped off them in battles. So it was just this barrier you had to get past when you were an infant. If I can look okay then, I'll be fine. It doesn't matter what I lose later on. But yes, there's this difficulty in accepting people who are not born looking perfect. Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting dichotomy there, as you say. Should that disfigurement occur later on, because it could happen to any of us, but the notion of being born a certain way carries that stigma with it, that that you didn't start off as and I used the inverted commas, that perfect human being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next you might go to as a mother to have your child accepted. Or not just father too.
Yeah, and how would you protect that? I mean, I look again, the issues that you raise, it might be set so many centuries back. But it's an issue that people battle now. I was thinking about the campaign of changing places, facilities, for people with disabilities, especially older people, and we're still not there yet. But so thank you for raising that in a way. We can read it and be comfortable in a way, and still think about those things. Now, it's at this point that I want to ask, because it's nice in the midpoint. Your titles. I mean, your titles just pull me in because of the the iconic beasts that are found within the title. And again, did you set off? Well, you set off thinking it would be one book, and so fine. So the choice to continue with titles that bear, the inclusion of that animal, the choices that you've made around that.
The first one, I suppose, was influenced, of course, by the Tomb of the Eagles in Orkney. So that one just leapt out. Wolf at the Gate. I love having animals in my books anyway, and there's quite often a dog around somewhere. I'm actually more of a cat person myself, but dogs seem to get into the books, and I do like dogs. So yes, the dog Freya in A Wolf at the Gate made that one come out. And Dragon in the Snow just leapt into my head. I don't know why, but I think I'm probably going to have a bear and a raven still in the series at some point.
Yeah.
But yes, and my cover illustrator Helen is very good at drawing these ideas out. So
it's really, I think you must be a mind reader, because the list of questions that I have before me, the next one says book covers. So it's I love that. So how did you find her? Did you know her before? Has she done previous covers?
No, actually, I was looking. Originally, being an indie author, I'd done my own covers, some more successfully than others, shall we say. And I decided to look for an illustrator based in Scotland, because when I went online to look for illustrators that allegedly did Scottish books, there was an awful lot of what shall we call kilt ripping. A lot of bare chests and very modern looking characters in old costumes, being Laird Jamie and things like, not quite my style of book. So I thought I would try and find somebody who was actually genuinely based in Scotland and knew what the country looked like. And ironically, she's actually English, and very shortly afterwards moved back to England. But so I found her online. We haven't yet met, even though she's been doing my covers for several years now. One day we will go and shake hands.
Yeah.
But I love her work, particularly the Viking ones. I think she does a terrific job on those.
Would you be so good as to hold one up for us so that we could see it?
The proof copy, so it's got a line across it. But there's my dragon, and I've got the eagle here as well. Oops.
There's a simplicity about them, but they are so striking.
Yeah. I'm really delighted with them.
Yeah, beautiful. And while we're at the book covers, if we could talk a little bit about the video at the start of our time together, because I should say, viewers, not the work of Kelly and myself, not at all. Okay. Lexie, tell us about that opening section.
There's a lady I have, again, I've only met her very, very briefly and not properly, but we've communicated for some time. She writes music, including folk music, and we have collaborated a bit with me writing some lyrics for her music, which is a real challenge for me, but great fun. We haven't actually done anything with any of it yet, I think, but it has been great fun to do. She lives in the Black Isle. And when I was thinking about doing an online book launch because of the times we're living in, I remembered that she'd done an Orkney suite. And I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to use some of her music for this? Her name's Hilary de Vries, and I just think her Orkney music is absolutely lovely and very evocative of the place. And the one we've used for this is actually called Ward Hill, I think. And the Ward Hill, the Vart Hill, is very important in Dragon in the Snow, so it seemed absolutely perfect. She had a lovely one set in Bercy as well, but it was just a touch too cheerful for a crime novel, so we went to the Ward Hill. She's got some of her music more recently has been influenced by Japanese music as well, and by birdsong, and it's absolutely lovely.
Please can I urge you both to do something for the for public consumption, because I think that would be wonderful. Yeah, and we're at the moment again the connections here. You've made these beautiful connections, Lexie, without us even trying. The music there of Art Hill, Ward Hill, and their Ward Hill in the third book. So I think if you'd give us the reading from the third book, Dragon in the Snow. Thank you.
This is right at the beginning of the third book. Helga, Asmund's daughter, had many talents, for she was an excellent cook and managed her longhouse competently. But there were other things for which she was particularly well known about Bercy, notably the exact assessment of the qualities of handsome young men and the dispersal of her husband's silver. Both of these required observational skills and an attention to detail, and she had honed these like a smith honing a blade. It was a rare boat or ship that passed below her longhouse unnoticed, lest she should miss the opportunity of enjoying fancy goods, of whatever type, when they rounded the Broch of Bercy to beach in Thorfinn's harbour. Thus it was that, even though the air was dotted grey with snow, she saw the boat passing west along the coast, sailed by two men she barely troubled to examine, and another in a green hood who was worth a second or even a third glance. For a moment she thought it might even be Ketil Gunnarsson, but even as a smile curled her pretty mouth at the idea, she remembered it could not be him. He was safe at the Broch. Ketil Gunnarsson, warrior and general agent for Thorfinn Sigurdarson, was indeed at the Broch. But he did not feel safe at all. In fact, he was doing his best to avoid Thorfinn. It was true he was growing more accustomed to the islands and their eccentricities, both the land and the people. It seemed he was going to have to tolerate them anyway. When he had first worked for Thorfinn, he had barely stayed a few months in the same place. Thorfinn's earldom extended from Hjaltland in the north down to Whitby, when they could keep the locals quiet, in the south, taking in parts of Fife, most of Caithness, and reaching round to the Western Islands. And of course, it behoved Thorfinn also to have one or two trusted men at the Trondheim court, keeping an eye on the current king and making sure that any moves on Thorfinn's earldom could be countered swiftly and efficiently. That was in the days of raids and battles, murders and maimings, and a young man from Heatherbeer like Ketil, with no aptitude for his father's cup-making business, could see some action. But then Thorfinn killed his nephew Ronald, and Thorfinn regretted it, and Thorfinn travelled to Rome to make his penance. And now Thorfinn, recently become the father of twin boys, was more interested in church building and settlement making and law giving and tax raising. And since he'd chosen to base this fascinating new way of life on a peninsula poking assertively into the sea off the west mainland of Orkney, Ketil knew he was going to see more of the islands over the next few years than he had ever remotely intended. Prone to fogs, windy, and impractically flat compared with what Ketil thought of as his Trondheim home, the islands were not what he would have chosen for himself.
So Ketil is on the move, and you bring into this novel that two space dynamic in a way between Birse and Schappensee. Yeah. And again, your choice of those spaces, because there's a few to choose from, they're not up there. You could have and again, have you been there? Have you scouted things out, or was this book written from a place where you couldn't go and scout out the spaces?
No, luckily I went to Schappensee last summer, but I was intrigued. I think I'd intended to go to Schappensee when I went up anyway, but when I was up there, I found mention of the fact that Schappensee does not appear in the sagas. It's the only island of any size that doesn't. And there's been speculation over the years that the Vikings just didn't live on Schappensee, but that makes no sense because it's very fertile, it's right in the middle, easy to get to. Of course they would be there. And I just missed a talk by a lady who's done some research into place names in Schappensee, and lots of them are of Viking origin. So it's obvious that the Vikings were there, but nothing ever happened on Schappensee. And I thought, well, there's a challenge for a crime author.
And
something happened on Schappensee.
Yeah, and you have that line in the book, don't you? Nothing ever happens on Schappensee. I think it's, I think it's so filmic as well, that line. You know, you can just see nothing ever happens here. And then, oh, and
Yeah.
here it comes.
That was
And
tumbleweed
it's,
rolling down the street.
yeah, exactly. But in this most recent volume, then there's the whole notion of the fires. Are
Mm.
there not? It's these fires. Can you tell us a little bit about, because you've spoken before of it was a way of people to get at each other. It reminds me very much of it's a typical way of dealing with rivalry even nowadays in Galicia, in the north of Spain. People
Yeah.
burning each other's terrain and woods and things like that.
Yeah.
Is it this that's going on, or are these different kinds of fires now that are in this novel?
It's a different kind. They don't really know what kind for quite a long time. They have to work it out. And they're not sure what the purpose might be, because one of them kills people, one of them doesn't kill people. One of them starts at one end of the building, one of them starts at another, and then another one seems to have been set off with cooking oil or something. And they're not very clear just what's going on for quite a while. And then that's set against the idea of the Vart. If you've watched Lord of the Rings and you've seen the signal fires being lit across the mountains, that's exactly what the Vart is, the Ward Hill. That's where they would light a beacon to signal to another beacon site that it should be lit, to get a message over to Bercy to say, we need help. There's an invasion, there's a catastrophe of some kind. And that fire, of course, should be a beneficial fire, but these are not in the least beneficial fires.
And the dragon in the snow. Can you tell us what the dragon is? Or would it give too much away?
I think it's mostly wrapped up with the whole fire image of what's going on there. It very rarely snows in Orkney. Very, very rarely. It's too maritime. But when it does, it's unbelievably beautiful. Just lovely.
You send me off on a reverie again, and I have to keep coming back to now. I'm thinking of, okay, so our main protagonists, 3 books in, where are they at? Where are they at with working together? Where are they at in their own lives? What's happening for them both?
That's a good question. They're still quite prickly with each other. They've not really fully come to terms with each other as adults yet. I think they still both have that double image in their head of this grown-up who's also the child they knew so well. And you know, sometimes it's just very difficult to get past what a person would like when you first knew them. Even if they've developed over the years, and you still tease them about things that they probably never still do, that they've grown out of years before. And you have in jokes that are no longer really in jokes. They've worn out. So they're having to get to know each other really as grown-ups now. They've been through a few things together, and they'll have a few more to go. And they still have some secrets that they need to confess to each other.
And it's said that there's a growing dynamic, little frisson between them. I know. Do you? I mean, I know. You know, book 4 and 5, because we've already got the 2 animals that you're going to call them. So
Probably.
But do you think there's potential there, or do you think there's, you know, that there's too much history, both shared back in childhood and as they've gone on as adults, so it never really could happen?
You never really know with characters. Sometimes they just escape and do things you're not expecting them to do. So I might just have to wait and see. I don't know. Yeah.
Because I know of more than one reader, I think, who would love to see them. You know,
Yeah, there's a bit of that.
Form a union. I think, yeah. But all romance aside, it's almost like I just want to come back full circle and say, so from writing initially in the 1800s, in mainland Scotland,
Yeah.
to then shifting in space and time, do you feel you write with a different style, with a different voice, or is it still very evident that these are books by Lexie Conyngham because of your narrative style, the way that you create characters, or are you aware of real difference?
I like to think the language is different, that the Viking ones are a little more straightforward, the Georgian ones a little more slightly more flowery language, a bit more what you accept at the time. Certainly the way the characters speak. I think the sense of humor is probably the same. I think you could probably tell they were my books, but I try very hard not to let language jar. I got this weird obsession with not using the word orange in the Viking books because they wouldn't have had that as a sort of color term. So I tend to use ochre and amber and things like that, with the things they would be more familiar with. But that's my weird obsession. I probably do other things that I shouldn't do while I'm obsessing about oranges. But yes, metaphors and similes, I try to make them contemporary so that nobody's jerked out of thinking I'm reading about a Viking story. I'm reading about a Georgian story. So in that sense, yeah, some of the language will be different.
It'll be different. Now, I want to say that because I concentrated on these three novels because it's where you're at now, and I love your style. There's a beautiful flow to the way you write. Even as you say, there is a simplicity. I understand what you're saying about that, but it flows beautifully. But I have to ask you. You mentioned right back at the beginning, that you always wanted to write crime fiction, but writing contemporary or present day crime fiction, just with all the technology, would be like, oh no. And yet, doing investigation, medieval investigation with none of the benefits, did that not also pose a challenge to you? That how are these people going to solve these crimes with none of what we have now?
Fingerprints. It's a discipline. You have to keep it very pared down, and you have to know their limitations. In the first of the Murray ones, I had to find out what contemporary arsenic analysis was. But I know that was the contemporary arsenic analysis in 1802. That's that. Nowadays, I could write about contemporary arsenic analysis this week, and it might change next week.
Yeah.
That's what my brain can't cope with. But yes, the past is much more stable.
Mm-hmm. And how we have terminology, even if we're not in the profession. If we read a lot of crime fiction, we know the way they talk about things to each other, and over the centuries and centuries, thinking about the language that Ketil and Sigrid would have used to each other, without the benefit of modern technology and terminology, and so the way that's developed.
Yeah. Also, the challenge is to get the medical side right, even if they didn't know what it signified or didn't know what to look for. A modern reader will know, oh, hang on, that wouldn't have happened. A body wouldn't do that after X number of months or whatever. So you still have to have one head in the present, one part of your brain in the present.
I like it being like multi-headed. I think it's great. Yeah.
Like you.
So 3 books on, and you thrill me by saying this is not a trilogy. It shall, it's going further. Are you working on book 4 now?
No, I'm actually working on a Georgian one at the moment. Very, very, very slowly, because September is always a mad month for me, so I'm quite far behind. But I'm in Georgian London with another one of my heads, presumably.
Ooh. And so, is this a new series, or are you going back to previous series?
This is Murray. This is the 12th Murray Letho book.
Yeah.
It's nice to come back to him. It's like putting on an old pair of slippers and thinking, oh yeah, I know what he's thinking. That's nice. But then you have to challenge yourself to do something different with him. So he's off to London and Sussex.
Wonderful. Lexie, I'm aware that we probably should close our discussion. It's not something that I wish to do, because it's absolutely, it's fascinating to hear you talk about your work and where it's going now as well. I wish you all the very best, with the Conyngham murders, but also with whatever's to come. And I look forward to the next time we can meet and discuss your historical crime fiction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you everyone for watching with us. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion with Lexie Conyngham.